At the banquet, my husband Stephen and my in-laws ignored me for some reason. The rest of the family reacted the same way. Feeling suspicious, I pretended to go to the bathroom and secretly watched everyone from behind cover. Then I overheard a horrifying conversation. A barren daughter-in-law is an ominous presence in itself. That's right. Talking to such sinister people can curse us too. It's best not to deal with her. Hearing those words made me so angry that my body began to tremble. It's unforgivable to be accused of infertility and moreover ignored as if I didn't exist. It seems I have no choice but to proceed with my plan immediately. Slipping quietly out of the establishment, my phone vibrated. It was Stephen. "Hey, what did you do?" Stephen screamed in fear. As soon as he spoke, I giggled. "Why are you panicking? It's true, isn't it?" The image I showed on the screen seemed to have made Stephen furious, but the real counterattack will begin now. I'm going to show him hell. My name is Melissa. I'm 35 years old. 9 years ago, at the age of 26, I married Stephen. We met at a party. Stephen, who was 2 years older than me, was very kind, and we hit it off right away. When we started dating and thinking about getting married, Stephen told me he was going to move back to his hometown in the countryside and farm. The village, close to becoming a ghost town due to population decline, was feeling the crisis of neglect. I was surprised, but eventually decided to follow Stephen's passionate request and join him. I too was originally from a village, albeit a different one. I was tired of living in an unfamiliar town. Fortunately, my brother and his wife lived in my parents' house. The realization that there would be no need to take care of my parents in the future also drove me to the decision. After that, events progressed rapidly and we got married. I quit my job and moved to this tiny village, Stephen's hometown. Although it was called a village, most of it was made up of Stephen's relatives. We lived in the big house my in-laws had originally lived in and then moved to a small outbuilding on the neighboring property. They were cheerful and caring, always looking after us. Farming was hard, but living surrounded by nature was not bad. Above all, the people in this village were kind. When I mentioned this, Stephen said cheerfully, "It's all thanks to the keeper." The keeper is a statue located in the village square. Not only in the square, but similar statues were scattered all over the village. Some houses even had soft toys modeled after the keeper. This village had its own unique traditions. Everyone revered the keeper as a literal guardian deity. According to Stephen, the guardian never overlooked evil deeds and never forgave the wicked. Therefore, all the villagers were good people. Such legends can probably be found in any old village. Thinking about it, I didn't give it much thought. Life was peaceful, and I had completely forgotten about such things, but the nightmare was undoubtedly coming. A few years after moving in, I had become accustomed to farming. Waking up early and quickly harvesting vegetables was my daily routine. Every day was unremarkable, but one thing bothered me. We still hadn't had any children. I was about to turn 30. I had always thought it would happen naturally, but recently I started to feel anxious. This was because after a few years, more people began asking, "Don't you have kids yet?" Each time I cheerfully responded, "It's a blessing, but it's typical of an old farming village to bluntly ask such delicate questions." Everyone asked the same, even my in-laws, and occasionally an old man or woman passing by asked bluntly, "Why can't you have them?" I responded appropriately, but it gradually became annoying. One day after a break in harvesting, I was called by my mother-in-law while drinking water. "Hey, Melissa, how are you managing your marital relations?" Caught off guard by such an absurd question, I nearly spit out water. "It's strange that you haven't had children for so many years. Aren't you satisfying, Stephen?" An unimaginable statement came from my mother-in-law, and I was dumbfounded. In a panic, I said, "What are you talking about? Please stop. That's not something people normally discuss," and abruptly ended the conversation. Yet my mother-in-law continued, "It's important, you know." But I ignored her and stormed out of the room. I thought this village had old-fashioned values, but this is just ridiculous. It's creepy that they boldly ask about marital life. Having left the house, I decided to kill some time by walking to the square. Then I saw someone. Could it be a neighbor? I tensed up for a moment, worried they might start talking about children again. But when I saw her face, I was relieved. It was Emily, a woman who lives nearby. Emily smiled shyly. I smiled back. Emily is the only person in the village who doesn't make rude remarks to me. She's about 10 years younger than me, so she must be around 20 now. Emily isn't originally from this village. After her parents died in an accident, she was taken in by her distant relative, an old lady in this village. This happened just before I came to the village. After graduating from a high school nearby, she now helps out with her grandmother's orchard. We occasionally pass each other on the street, but she's quiet and not very talkative, so we don't really converse much. She doesn't hang out with anyone, so the villagers call her an oddball. I used to think Emily was a bit dull because she didn't interact much, but now I appreciate that she doesn't ask intrusive questions. I felt a bit cleansed thanks to Emily after the unpleasant experience with my mother-in-law. However, that didn't solve the problem. My mother-in-law, father-in-law, and other distant relatives in the neighborhood kept saying similar things. You need to be more assertive with your husband. You need to take the lead. They would say anything they wanted. My mother-in-law then said something that gave me chills. Last night's dinner was all vegetables. You should add more meat. Maybe adding garlic would boost Stephen's vitality. Why does she even know what we had for dinner last night? It's too nosy. Fed up, I decided to talk to Stephen about everything. I can't take it anymore. Everyone keeps asking about when we're going to have kids. Your mom also pressed too much into our marital life. Honestly, it's tough. Stephen, who was watching TV, responded without taking his eyes off the screen. What are you talking about? Mom and everyone else are just worried about you. Worried? That's prying. Doesn't she say anything to you? Why would they say anything to me? Infertility is a woman's responsibility, isn't it? Stephen casually said something unbelievable. I was shocked that he had such outdated knowledge. I was appalled. It's not always the woman's fault. Sometimes it's a compatibility issue, or it could even be the man's fault. Me? No way. Stephen looked confused, genuinely puzzled. I understand the elderly in the village having old values, but I was surprised that even Stephen, who is relatively young, thought this way. Anyway, I want a child too. I'm thinking about getting fertility treatment. We need to find the cause before we can address it. I suggested to Stephen that we go to a doctor together, but as expected, Stephen was reluctant and made excuses. Why should a man go to such a place? He complained, but I managed to persuade him to agree on the condition that we go to a hospital a bit far from the village. Later, we went to a hospital in another city and both got tested. A few weeks later, when we returned to the hospital, the doctor told us a fact. There's no issue with you, Melissa. The problem is with your husband. He does not produce sperm. He has azoospermia. The moment Stephen heard this, he exploded. What? It can't be my fault? Are you kidding me? Stephen suddenly stood up and started yelling. I had never seen Stephen like this before. The doctor, with a troubled look, showed us the test results on a paper. Staring at the paper, Stephen fell silent with a terrible expression. He must have been shocked. I felt sorry for him and couldn't say anything. That night, I spoke to Stephen kindly. The doctor said if we do more detailed tests, we might find the cause and get treatment. It's a bit far, but I'll help. But Stephen just looked down and didn't reply. He probably never imagined that he could be the cause. Feeling sorry for him, I couldn't say anything more and silently left the room. But soon I realized that feeling sympathy was a mistake. Stephen's attitude began to worsen. The cruel truth of his azoospermia seemed to have shredded his pride as a man. Perhaps in an effort to regain his shattered self-esteem, he became unusually aggressive. I was the main target of his frustrations. He criticized me for being slow at farm work, for the food not being tasty enough. He started picking fights over trivial things, growing angrier more frequently. Initially, I remained silent, thinking he just couldn't accept the test results, feeling sorry for him. But as it continued, I too began to lose my patience. Our arguments increased, turning our home into a constant battleground. Naturally, there was no intimacy, so having children was out of the question. Going to the hospital for treatment was absolutely out of the question. Moreover, the villagers still believed my infertility was to blame. The situation where I was the only one criticized remained unchanged. I wanted to tell Stephen's parents the truth, but Stephen glared at me with icy eyes, warning, "Don't tell anyone." The thought of what might happen if I spoke up was frightening, and I didn't have the courage to do it. Besides, I wasn't even sure if they would believe me. After all, everyone's thinking was outdated. The conventional belief that infertility is a woman's fault prevailed. That's probably why Stephen had reacted so violently when he was pointed out as the cause. As this life continued, I started to feel I couldn't bear it anymore. I understood he was shocked, but this was outright displacement of blame, and I felt like a punching bag. Maybe it would be better to separate. I was beginning to think that way. Half a year passed, and Stephen's snide remarks continued. By then, I had firmly decided to get a divorce. However, The problem was, once again, the old-fashioned mindset of the village. Divorce was seen as disgraceful. I had heard rumors of a woman who suggested divorce being verbally abused by her husband. Considering this, it was unlikely I would get easy consent, so I thought about leaving the signed divorce papers and fleeing the village. It was a drastic measure, but I was driven to it. I began to prepare secretly so that Stephen wouldn't notice. Then, the next month, Stephen was supposed to be out of the village for the day delivering crops. It was the perfect opportunity. But while I was packing my bags, the front door opened. There stood Stephen, who was supposed to be out. His eyes were furious as he shouted, "Where are you going?" When I remained silent, Stephen glanced at the divorce papers on the desk. "You were going to divorce me? Are you kidding me? If people find out my wife ran away, it would be a disgrace. Don't you dare embarrass me." It was the reaction I had expected. After a tirade of abuse, he threatened, "If you ever think about running away again, you know what will happen," and glared at me sharply. My plan had failed. I was desperate. Yet how had he found out? I had been careful to act discreetly. From then on, Stephen's treatment of me worsened. He complained that the cleaning wasn't thorough, that just seeing my face irritated him. Any backtalk from me would lead to serious trouble. "You are the worst kind of woman running away from her husband. The guardian sees everything. Your misdeeds will be exposed." That became Stephen's mantra. Lately, even the mention of the guardian by the villagers started to disgust me. I had thought it was just superstition, but could that statue really be watching me? It's hard to believe that those trying to escape the village receive punishment, but the fact that my whereabouts and actions were precisely guessed was indeed true. I had become utterly frightened. Gradually, a sense of resignation began to grow within me. As time passed, I was about to turn 35. One day, Emily, who lives nearby, came to visit. "It's rare to see you. What's up?" Over time, Emily and I had started to talk a bit whenever we met. Unlike the other villagers who thrived on rumors and judged harshly, Emily never pried into my life and always treated me with unchanged kindness, the only woman who did so. "Melissa, there's something I really need to say." I was taken aback by the seriousness on Emily's face. I invited her inside and made some coffee. Then Emily looked around nervously and gestured for me to come closer without saying a word. We entered a room that was now used as a storage room and seldom entered. What's going on?" As I followed her in confused, I asked her this question, and she murmured as if relieved, "We should be safe here." Then she began to pour out her words as if a dam had burst. "I can't take it anymore. This village That's when she told me a shocking fact. It was about the true nature of this terrifying village. Months later, since then, Emily and I had met secretly several times. After learning the truth about the village, we had been trying to figure out a way to escape. The truth Emily shared was shocking. Hearing such things only made me more eager to escape as soon as possible, but we needed to act carefully. If our plan was discovered, it would be over. It took time, but finally, the day to act was set. This Sunday, a banquet related to the guardian, held once every few years, would gather all the village relatives. We couldn't miss this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Emily and I had discussed and done what needed to be done. Everything was prepared. All that was left was to put our plan into action. The gathering was at night. The venue was the village's only restaurant. Although the building was old, it had enough capacity to accommodate most of the villagers. Like years ago, I went there in the afternoon to help as I had helped before. My in-laws were there, so I greeted them with good morning. However, after a brief glance at me, they quickly disappeared somewhere. Maybe they were busy. Thinking so, I decided to help with preparing the food. But not just my in-laws. The other relatives, too, were unresponsive to anything I asked. In fact, to be honest, they were ignoring me. Had I done something wrong? Confused, time passed, and it became night. Soon, the relatives and other villagers began to arrive. Stephen was among them, but his attitude was the same. For some reason, he ignored me. It felt like I had become a ghost. Without understanding why, only anxiety and irritation grew within me. So I pretended to go to the restroom to secretly listen to their conversations. Then a terrifying conversation hit my ears. Melissa never did have children, did she? At her age, it's probably impossible now. Oh dear. An infertile daughter-in-law is just bad luck. She must be cursed by the guardian, my mother-in-law began with a tone of disgust, and a clearly drunk Stephen nodded in agreement. Yeah, talking to such an unlucky person might curse us too. It's better for everyone not to deal with her. Of course, I made sure to inform the villagers last night. I told them that speaking to Melissa would bring the guardian curse, my father-in-law added with a laugh. Hearing their words, I began to shake with anger. Unforgivable. It wasn't my fault I couldn't have children, and to be deemed an ominous presence, to be ignored on top of that. Is this what adults do? No matter how you look at it, this village is wrong. We should carry out our plan immediately. We intended to flee this village, but that alone wasn't enough to settle my feelings. I had to somehow strike back at them. I was resolved. Soon, Emily appeared from the venue. The timing was perfect. Without saying a word, Emily and I nodded to each other. Then I turned off the lights at the venue. Suddenly it was dark and voices could be heard asking, "What happened? Is it a power outage?" Amidst the confusion, Emily tampered with a computer that was placed in a corner of the venue. Originally, there was a computer, projector, and screen set up for today's event to reflect on the Guardian and the history of the village. We decided to use that setup. After a while, a certain image appeared on the screen. "What is this?" Stephen screamed. My in-laws, other relatives, and villagers were also staring at the screen, causing a commotion. "Who did this? Melissa, where are you?" Stephen became frantic and started causing a scene, so Emily and I decided to retreat for the moment. We discreetly left the venue and met outside. About 3 minutes had passed since we escaped when my phone began to vibrate repeatedly. It was Stephen calling relentlessly. "Melissa, what have you done?" he screamed in agony as soon as I answered. I chuckled. "What are you panicking for? It's the truth, isn't it?" It seemed like everyone was under the wrong impression, so I just wanted to set the record straight. The image projected was the result of a medical examination from years ago. It was a diagnosis that confirmed Stephen's azoospermia. The large text displayed on the big screen was enough to astonish everyone present at the venue. Stephen, having his closely guarded secret exposed, was in a state of panic. He seemed extremely confused and kept shouting incoherently. He was making so much noise that I quickly hung up the phone. My phone kept vibrating afterward, but of course I ignored it. Emily looked at me with concern. "Is everything okay?" Just as I expected. "But we need to push a little more. The harm I had suffered wasn't something I could just let go of." Emily and I returned to the banquet hall together. Peeking into the venue, it had turned into a scene of utter chaos. "Is this really true? You were infertile, Stephen? It can't be." Everyone was confronting Stephen. His face turned pale as he kept saying, "This is a lie. It's a conspiracy by Melissa," sweating profusely as he made excuses. The villagers had believed that our inability to have children was my fault, the woman's fault. But the truth was different. At the time of the examination, there was nothing about me that could cause infertility. It was Stephen's azoospermia that had prevented us from having children. Yet without being able to tell the truth, I was blamed. I was reproached as if not having children was a sin, and my existence was ignored. The numerous verbal abuses and the painful days I had to endure were not something I could forgive. Emily and I entered the buzzing venue. "Melissa, what are you doing?" Stephen shouted at me. "Don't mess with me. Doing something like this, you'll be cursed by the Guardian. You'll face terrible consequences." At his words, I snapped. "What Guardian? You were just spying with security cameras. How creepy." As I said this, the room fell silent. Hitting the nail on the head, Stephen, my in-laws, and the villagers turned pale. Yes, the Guardian was not a protective deity. In fact, surveillance cameras were installed inside the Guardian. Cameras were hidden not only inside the stone statues around the village, but also inside the stuffed toys of the Guardian that were displayed in our living rooms. These were monitored by board elders in a room at the community center who watched the actions of outsiders. That's why my attempts to escape were well known. I had learned this from Emily on that day, about 10 years ago, around the time Emily was taken in by an elderly woman in the village after losing her parents. Lonely, Emily had once secretly followed her grandmother to work because she missed her. Her grandmother went to the community center. There, she and the elders laughed and chatted while watching the villagers through surveillance cameras. At that moment, Emily learned about the village's secret legacy of the Guardian cameras. Shocked, Emily somewhat understood the village atmosphere and why rumors spread so quickly. Was this it? It was bad enough to be the subject of idle gossip, but being watched while walking down the street or even inside the house was too much. Emily despised the village's tendency to invade others' privacy. Emily tried to stay out of the gossip, so the villagers started calling her odd for not joining their circle. She was fed up with the village, but she had no relatives and nowhere else to go. She had no choice but to endure life there. But one day, as her 25th birthday approached, her grandmother began pressuring her to go on arranged dates. "You need to have children soon, or you'll end up infertile like Melissa," she was told, and persistently pushed to marry an elderly widower living on the edge of the village. Naturally, Emily refused such an unreasonable demand. However, her grandmother began to threaten her, saying that such defiance would bring the curse of the guardian upon her. When Emily could no longer bear it, she thought of me, hoping I could help. Knowing the tragic experiences I had faced due to gossip, she approached me to escape the village together. The reason Emily had moved from the living room to another room that day without speaking was that she had spotted a guardian plushie there. I hadn't paid any attention. I thought it was just another plushie common around the village, but there was a camera hidden inside it. It was likely installed by Stephen to monitor my activities. That explained why my every move seemed to be known. When I tried to escape, and even when my mother-in-law accurately guessed what we had for dinner, because they were watching through the camera, it was obvious to them. I felt a chill at the sheer horror of it. My instincts told me it was dangerous to stay in this village. Taking up Emily's suggestion, we decided we must escape the village as soon as possible. We planned together, but was escaping enough? I felt I couldn't rest without avenging the years of mistreatment. I thought about it. First, I had to clear my own name and then Emily's. "Did you talk, traitor?" her foster grandmother yelled furiously. But Emily glared back at her. "I appreciate that you took me in when I had no one, but I can't stand living like this, sneaking around, peeking into other people's lives, living off gossip and backstabbing. I absolutely hate it." "How could you say that?" The grandmother and the other villagers began to make a commotion. To silence them, I decided to deliver the final blow. I manipulated the computer and displayed new images on the screen. The images that appeared one after another shocked everyone. Stephen flirting with a young woman in the village, my mother-in-law secretly adding the juice of a dirty rat to the coffee she served at village meetings, my father-in-law putting his hands around the shoulders and waist of a married woman, Emily's grandmother stealing vegetables from someone's garden, and almost all the villagers caught in embarrassing acts they wouldn't want to be known. Everyone at the venue was speechless. Stephen exclaimed, "When did you take these pictures? Why was it possible to capture such compromising photos of everyone?" Emily explained. "It was impossible that all the villagers were good people. Knowing where the cameras were, they would have acted in the blind spots if they had anything to hide." We focused on the blind spots, places that were out of sight of the guardian statues and plushies, and identified the most convenient spots for misdeeds to occur, where we planted our own small cameras purchased online. Then the village scandals just kept coming out. The villagers were naturally committing minor wrongs in places they thought were not covered by cameras. They had claimed all along that all the villagers were good people. It was truly laughable. We captured crucial moments from the camera footage and saved them, and now we exposed those images in broad daylight. An eye for an eye. Since my privacy was violated, I did the same to them. This should teach them how deplorable it is to indulge in spreading rumors about others. The villagers fell silent in shame. "What do you mean all villagers are good people, just a bunch of scum? You enjoy spying on outsiders and having a laugh. Give me a break. I don't want to stay in this outdated, privacyless village for one more second," I shouted loudly and thrust the divorce papers in front of Stephen. Caught off guard, Stephen stood frozen, mouth agape. My in-laws and villagers were also stunned. They probably never thought I would fight back. Indeed, there was a time when I almost gave up, but now with Emily as my ally, finding a way out, I could no longer just sit back and take it. I looked down quietly at them, stunned. "Goodbye, pitiful everyone." "Goodbye," echoed Emily, her gaze full of contempt for the villagers. We left the banquet hall without looking back. Once outside, we picked up 2 suitcases that we had hidden in the barn. These contained all the essentials we needed for our new lives. The divorce papers were already left at the house, and now, with these suitcases, all we had to do was walk out of the village. However, as we were leaving, I suddenly stopped in my tracks. "What's wrong?" Emily asked, puzzled. "I just have to do this," I said, grabbing a hoe that was leaning against a farmhouse. I headed to the square and swung the hoe with all my might. A tremendous noise erupted as the statue of the guardian was spectacularly destroyed. Of course, the surveillance camera inside it shattered into pieces as well. That was quite spectacular, Melissa. There's no point in leaving that thing intact. That felt refreshing. We laughed together, then we destroyed every single small guardian statue throughout the village. Naturally, we had already thrown away any related plushies inside the house. It's incredible to think how frightening this setup was. The guardian statues were originally created long ago to scare misbehaving children. The guardian will scold you if you do something bad was an effective piece of education back then. But as times changed, this method of teaching young children evolved into a tool for punishing anyone the villagers disliked. It mainly targeted people like me, who came from outside the village, and those like Emily, who did not try to blend in. Initially, it was just a way for people to gather and nitpick on those who did not conform to village norms. It probably started as just a bit of idle gossip to pass the time. However, over time, this gossip evolved into a network of surveillance cameras ensuring constant monitoring in this closed-off village. The absurd superstition of the guardian became a normalized justification for spying on others. Not only is it problematic to expose people's privacy, but the persistence in outdated thinking is equally troubling. The negative energy filling this warped village eventually seemed to corrode the hearts of its residents more than any curse or retribution. I have come to find human actions far more frightening. I refuse to stay in such a place any longer. We left the backward, rotten village behind without a backward glance. Later, I heard through the grapevine that infighting had begun among the villagers after I exposed their wrongdoings. Following ugly disputes, the villagers split up. Communication completely broke down, impacting even their farming activities. Lack of coordination led to frequent mistakes, and blame shifting began. Naturally, the quality of vegetables deteriorated, and the agricultural cooperative started to complain. The village could no longer sell its produce. As a result, almost everyone fell into poverty. As for Stephen, he managed to get divorced. Worried that he wouldn't file the divorce papers I had left at home, I consulted a lawyer after leaving the village. The lawyer intervened, and it turned out Stephen did fill out and submit the divorce papers. He apparently remarried quickly because he wanted to be with the woman he had an affair with, who lived on the outskirts of the village. But with the village facing a food shortage, Stephen's household was also struggling to make ends meet. The woman he remarried eventually left him. My in-laws were also out of money and spent their days in constant quarrels. No matter how miserable they became, I could not muster any sympathy for them. I never want to have anything to do with them again, nor do I wish to remember them. As for Emily and me, we are now living peacefully in a new place. However, the journey here was not easy. Emily had no relatives, and at my parents' home, my brother and his wife were living, so I couldn't impose on them. After leaving the village, we had no one to rely on. That's why we had already started looking for jobs in secret before we left. Because of the surveillance cameras, we couldn't move around too openly. We planned our meetings in a camera-free storage shed and arranged everything via computer. This took some time, but after several online interviews, I finally found a job. My experience in clerical work before I got married came in handy. I was hired as a temporary employee, which was fine by me. We had also found a small place to live. No matter how cramped, it was far better than the village environment. Since Emily had no experience outside of farm work and was struggling to find a job, she decided to live with me in my place while looking for work. Soon after we left the village, Emily secured a job. Fortunately, being in her 20s and willing to start in an entry-level position helped despite her lack of experience. Eventually, my hard work was recognized and I was promoted to a permanent employee. My salary increased, and I was able to move from a small place to a condo. Subsequently, Emily became independent and moved into a nearby condo. Now we both have made friends at work and in our community, enjoying every day. Leaving the village was truly the best decision. There was a time when I lost my husband, my home, and my job. But by having the courage to start anew, I was able to reshape my life. I wish I could tell my past self not to give up. By acting with hope and not giving up, I have achieved the life I have today.